Okay, once again, I don't know where this is going. I'm about to publish a book of stories. It's 108 spiritual stories, and these are stories from all different traditions. I have stories from the Jewish tradition, I have stories from the Hindu tradition, Buddhist tradition. I even have stories about like the Sufi tradition from Islam, which are the Sufis are the Islamic mystics. I have a story about Zoroaster. I have a story about Isis. I also have stories about religious spiritual figures, but most of the stories are more like kind of cute, funny stories found in different traditions. And I asked about maybe 15% of the stories are me being lazy and asking ChatGPT or DeepSeek to create stories for me. But I prompted, prompted them, told them what I wanted. And today I thought I would read this one about Jesus. I asked, I think it was ChatGPT to do a funny retelling of Jesus based on the four Gospels accounts. And I guess, I don't know if I said other literature as well that talks about Jesus, but and I asked ChatGPT to talk about the contradictions as well. Now, let me just say, I did a video the other day about gospel contradictions. I don't think that the contradictions are necessarily mean that the stories weren't based on historical fact. I think that's a question that's up in the air. My point is that at least you have to acknowledge the contradictions and say, okay, there are contradictions between these gospels, right? There's some that you can't necessarily just say sweep under the rug. You have to confront the contradictions. There's apologetics. Apologetics is found in Christianity, but it's found in just every tradition has their own form of apologetics. Apologetics is basically how to explain these things, how to answer the people that are the critics or the non-believers when they bring up these points, like, oh, well, it says, Mark says this, Mark doesn't have any resurrection, post-resurrection, or resurrection and appearances to the disciples, whereas the other Gospels do. So how do you explain that? And if Mark was the first Gospel, then, what does that mean? And so apologetics is a way to explain. Sometimes you might say explain away the problems. So I don't, my bringing this all up is to talk about, how do we confront these things, and what kind of reasoning do we use, and do we, how correct, you might say, or how sound is our, use that word, how sound is our reasoning when trying to talk about these things. And it is important I think, to be reasonable, right? We can't just have blind faith. I mean, if you have blind faith and it works for you, then more power to you, right? Maybe you don't need the reasoning. Maybe you've bypassed that. Maybe you've not bypassed, but maybe you just don't need it, right? But for the rest of us, poor mortals, we might need that. We might need to learn to think a little bit more clearly about these things and maybe struggle with them a little bit. So Jesus, the greatest story ever told, now with footnotes. This is ChatGPT. That's ChatGPT's title. The greatest story ever told, now with footnotes. Jesus of Nazareth, Savior, Storyteller, Sandwich Multiplier. Once upon a time, in the dusty outpost of the Roman Empire, God decided to be born. But being God, He didn't just show up like, hey, I'm here, let's fix things. No, he made entrance, virgin birth, stars in the sky, and wandering astrologers on camels bearing gifts that definitely weren't baby appropriate. Now, obviously Mark and John don't have the nativity aspect, right? The nativity, or wait, which one, right? There's two different nativity stories. Matthew says Jesus was born in a house in Bethlehem, visited by wise men, no number given, guided by a GPS star. Luke says Jesus was born in a manger because there was no room at the inn, and instead of wise men, shepherds show up, who were just minding their own sheep when bam, sky angels. Contradiction alert number 1. Was Jesus born in a house, Matthew, or a barn, Luke? Also, were Mary and Joseph originally from Bethlehem, Matthew, or Nazareth, Luke? Matthew had them flee to Egypt because of King Herod, who tried to murder all the baby boys. Luke has them return to Nazareth quietly. It's like reading two completely different Yelp reviews of the same birth. Jesus the teenager, mostly MIA. We know almost nothing about Jesus from age 2 to 30, except that one time he was 12 and ditched his parents to hang out in the temple like a precocious philosophy major. When Mary and Joseph finally find him, he's like, didn't you know I'd be in my father's house? Which is either sweet or an ancient equivalent of, duh, mom. You know, take it for what this is. Baptism, the wilderness in early days. At around age 30, Jesus shows up to be baptized by his wild-eyed cousin, John the Baptist, who lives on bugs and shouts things at rivers. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all say John baptizes Jesus. A dove appears, and God says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." John's Gospel, however, skips the baptism scene altogether. John the Baptist sees Jesus and says, "Behold the Lamb of God," but doesn't dunk him. Apparently, in this version, Jesus is already glowing, which fits with John's Christology or theology that he was the Logos. He was with God from the beginning. He did not need to be baptized. And that also gets rid of this whole thing about, well, how can John baptize Jesus? You know, that doesn't make sense. If Jesus is God, how can a mortal man baptize someone who's, God incarnate? Contradiction alert number 2. Did John baptize Jesus or not? Depends on which gospel you read. Jesus then goes into the wilderness for 40 days to be tempted by Satan, which includes turning stones into bread, jumping off the temple with angelic trampoline support, and being offered all the kingdoms of the world, which ironically Jesus already sort of owns. Awkward. This is not the greatest retelling by any stretch of the imagination, but this is what it is. I might redo this one, actually, now that I'm reading it closer. Jesus assembles the squad. He gathers 12 disciples, none of whom have resumes. Just fishermen, a tax collector, a zealot, which is either a political radical or an ancient version of an internet troll, and a guy named Judas. Spoiler, trust issues. They go to town. Jesus heals the sick, feeds the hungry, walks on water, curses a fig tree for no real reason, and turns water into wine, making him the number 1 wedding guest of all time. Also, he loves to tell parables, short stories with a moral, like, be like the Good Samaritan, don't bury your talents, don't build your house on sand, don't be the guy who shows up to the banquet without proper RSVP. The disciples frequently nod in deep understanding and then immediately ask dumb questions, which is an interesting aspect, of the gospel, starting with Mark, is that the apostles are not the sharpest tools in the shed, which definitely makes you question the veracity of the reporting, the oral traditions. If they didn't understand Jesus then, how were they gonna explain, and the Gospels were not written until years later. So how were they going to correctly relate what was being said, right? this is one of the biggest, for me, this is a very important one, which is how they understood what Jesus was saying. Did they report it accurately? Did they remember accurately? If they were fishermen, could they write it down? Maybe they didn't even know how to write. Maybe they didn't know how to read. The Gospels were written in Greek decades later. So what does that mean? The miracles. Oh yes, so many. He heals the blind, raises the dead, calms storms with a word, drives demons into pigs, who then commit mass pig suicide, which the locals don't love, feeds the 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fish, which mathematically makes him the most efficient caterer in history. Contradiction alert number 3. Did Jesus cleanse the temple at the start of his ministry, John, or near the end of the other Gospels? Hard to say. He may have just had a habit of flipping tables. Now, this has been pointed out, too, that the table, this is where we get the idea of a turntable, right? The turntable, Jesus invented the turntable. That's the way I would look at it. He's the cosmic DJ, right? But it doesn't really necessarily comport with, there's certain things about Jesus's character doesn't completely fit, that he would get angry, upset, and overturn these tables. But the harder thing that scholars have pointed out to reconcile here is that the temple was huge, right? And I think the point that they make is this whole thing with the overturning the money changers' tables does not really fit with what the reality was. Sounds like a good story, in other words. The triumphal entry and Last Supper. Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey. Matthew, always aiming for prophecy points, says Jesus rides 2 animals at once, like some kind of divine circus act, which is also weird and seems to be Matthew's taking literally this passage in one of the prophets. I forget which one. And does seem to be like, let's try to fit the story to fit what was written in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. Contradiction alert number 4, 1 donkey or 2, depends on whether you think Jesus is doing stunt riding. Then comes the Last Supper, where Jesus says, this is my body, this is my blood, and everyone nods, still not really understanding what's going on. Then Judas betrays him for 30 silver coins, and Peter swears he'll never deny him, before denying him 3 times by breakfast. The trials. Now, one thing I want to point out is, now you could say, well, this all sounds too like formulaic and literary and stylistic to be a real thing, right? The Gospels seem to be too literary, too much of a literary creation. On the other hand, you could say, well, if Jesus really was who the Gospels say he was, then why wouldn't it all sound too incredible, right? Maybe, who are you to say? You don't know, what's possible. Now, and I will say that I've seen some things, in my life that been with teachers at a very, very high level, and things happen with them that is really amazing, you can't explain. And there's a lot of inexplicable things in life. So, you have to weigh all these things, and you can't, that's why I don't think it's helpful to be so quick to pass a judgment one way or the other. That said, to me, when I read the Gospels, and considering all this other information, like we don't have any oral reports. We don't have any other documents that corroborate what the Gospels are saying, besides the Gospels themselves, and they might have all been using each other, right? We don't have the Q, what's called Q. We don't have any source documents. So it does, and given that it was written, these Gospels were probably written decades later, in a different place, in a different language, with an agenda, apparently a theological agenda, does not look good for the historicity of it. And that's why I struggle to understand why, scholars are very tied to the historicity idea. But anyway, the trials and crucifixion, Jesus is arrested, tried, and crucified, but again, details vary. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have him largely silent before Pilate. John has him giving confident theological TED Talks. My kingdom is not of this world. Contradiction alert number 5. What were Jesus' last words? Matthew and Mark, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which is one of the Psalms. This video is a lot like the video I did the other day, but you might not have seen it. You might have seen it, but my God, why have you forsaken me? I believe it's Psalm 22. In Luke, Jesus says, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit, which suggests, and that's also from one of the Psalms, suggests that Jesus was not suffering on the cross. And you can understand that my God, why have you forsaken me, also as Jesus was not suffering. But if you understand that psalm actually ends on a good note. In John, Jesus says, it is finished. Again, it does not seem like he's suffering. Either he made 3 separate closing speeches, or the gospel writers choose their own dramatic ending. Now, someone online, I posted this on Facebook, and someone online said, well, really what it is that you had different eyewitnesses, saw different things, heard different things. And I don't think that's a good, I don't think that's the greatest argument, I mean, it's true that even today, this moment, there might be something that happens and everyone has a different story about it. That's true, that generally happens. And so the Gospels will vary because people have different stories about what happened, but they don't doubt that Jesus was actually crucified. It's just there's a doubt about what he actually said, what his last words were. On the other hand, you would think that people would remember his last words, right? that there wouldn't be any contradiction. This is one of those things that I would say is one of the most crucial contradictions, is that they weren't clear about what his last words were. And I would also think that people wouldn't hear his last words. How close were they really to him that they could even hear what he was saying? I don't know. It's all hard to believe, actually. I don't doubt the idea of Christ. I just doubt the historicity and that the Gospels weren't more than literary mythologizing. The resurrection, aka he's not in there. The tomb is empty, but who goes to the tomb and when? In Matthew, Mark, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary go. In Mark, same, but ends abruptly with everyone too afraid to say anything, unless you count the later added verses in Mark, right? Mark has some added verses. They seem to be interpolated later. Luke, a whole group of women and 2 angelic men. John, Mary Magdalene alone, who mistakes the risen Jesus for a gardener. Contradiction alert number 6, who saw Jesus first? Depends. Either a group of women, just Mary, or nobody said anything at all. Either way, he's back. That's also, I think, kind of a difficult one, who saw him first. But that's not as, I don't think that's as crucial as Jesus' last words. Final thoughts. And then Jesus ascends into heaven after telling his disciples to spread the news, forgive people, love their enemies, and not get too hung up on wealth or status. It's the beginning of a spiritual movement that would go on to change the world. But also, let's be honest, the 4 Gospels don't always agree on the timeline, the dialogue, or even the furniture. It's somehow, through contradiction and mystery, the story still moves people, still inspires faith, and still sparks a really good brunch conversation. Yeah. It's not the greatest retelling of the Jesus story. Like I said, I might do another one. I might have DeepSeek do another retelling of the story. Maybe that doesn't go into the contradiction so much. But it's important to bring in the contradictions, just because if you're going to retell the story, you kind of have to deal with, well, what, you have to pick which gospel account you want to say is true, right? Anyway, this book is going to be out very soon on Amazon. It's 108 stories. It's called Wonder Stories. It's based on a Yes song, the rock band Yes. They have a really lovely song called Wonder Stories. And I really did this book for my wife and my son. And hopefully he's just learning to read now, and I hope it will be something that he will grow with. And I think it's also for children of all ages, and you might enjoy it too. So I will post the link once I have it. And thanks for tuning in. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and see you very soon.